Today's guest, Dr. Marcus Ross, is an associate professor of geology and biology and chemistry department at the Liberty University, where he is also the assistant director of the Center for Creation Studies. We are so delighted that you're here today.
Thank you,
Dr. Ross. Thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure to actually be here. This is fantastic.
I just need to say that I hear such wonderful things about Liberty these days, and one of the things that excites me is that you guys really teach creation.
We do. We do. The department that I'm in, biology and chemistry, we've got over 30 faculty. All are committed Christians, committed creationists, and my department chair likes to say we're the largest accumulation of PhD creationists in the world.
Well, we're honored that you're here today, and we're going to talk about 12 years in Athens. Now, I don't think this is a travel log, so tell us what that means.
It's a travel log of sorts. It's my journey through. It is. It's a life's journey on this sort of thing. So we'll be drawing some ideas from Paul and how it is that I went through secular universities as a model of Athens.
That's great. I think it's wonderful because we've been doing some shows talking about how we lose 50 to 75% of our young people when they go off to college. Mm-hmm. But you're that city on the hill, that shining light that shows that you can keep your faith, and your faith not only in Jesus, but in the accuracy of God's Word.
Yeah, you can, and it takes a purpose and a dedication to do so. But it's one of those things that through God's grace, you can walk through environments that are sometimes very, very hostile towards your faith, towards your beliefs, maintaining your integrity along the way.
Amen. So walk through with us, or let us walk with you.
Well, just for the viewers that are watching, I'm obviously a Christian. I'm a paleontologist, which means I study fossils. Ever since I was a kid, about 4.5 years old, I caught the dinosaur bug and ran with it. I teach at Liberty University, and so my vocation is as a college professor. I like to think of my job as translating egghead into human. I teach a lot of classes for non-science majors and try and help them understand where a scientist is coming from.
Great.
And I'm a young earth creationist and have been my entire life. But going through and getting trained to be a paleontologist meant that I was going to be going into an academic environment that argued very strongly for an ancient Earth, for biological evolution, for a whole bunch of processes in non-catastrophic geology, ways in which they understand the Earth to be many billions of years old that were just completely at odds with what I felt. My whole life was spent in the public school system. I didn't spend a single day in a Christian educational setting until I was behind the lectern at Liberty University going, wait, I can pray in front of the class? And it's not a math test day, right? I mean, we can pray any day at all in front of everyone. They're never going to get prayer out of the public schools as long as there are math tests.
Yes, that's right.
So, but going from K through PhD in all state-run schools meant that I found myself in hostile territory. As you well know, you can't teach young earth creationism in science classes in the public schools, and the universities don't advocate this position as well. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and so really it was pre-internet time, and so the availability of information was very, very limited. It wasn't really until I was an undergraduate, after my first year or so, that I realized, okay, I'm a creationist, but I really didn't know what to argue about in these things of geology, and this is my major. This is what I'm going into. So this was a tough place to be. Now, a lot of folks who talk about apologetic issues go and look at what Paul does. And sometimes Paul kind of gets a bad rap for Athens because it doesn't look like this was a very effective ministry opportunity for him. But it certainly was one of the most unusual. I mean, you go through Acts, Paul comes to a city, he speaks at the synagogue, he argues in the marketplace, they form a church, usually he gets beat up, and he goes on to, and it's the same formula all the time. Right. But then you get this one in Athens, right? He's been to Thessalonica, and the Thessalonians beat him and send him out of town. He goes to Berea, and of course we all know that Berea is the good place, because every town in the country has a Berean Baptist church or Berean something church.
Study those scriptures.
That's right. They studied the scriptures, and they received the gospel graciously and with fervor. But the Thessalonians, they said, wait, Paul's in Berea? That's only about a day's walk. And so they send a brute squad out to go get him, and so he hightails it out to Athens and leaves his companions to establish the church. So Paul finds himself in a place that he wasn't anticipating being in the first place. He doesn't have his team with him, so he doesn't have his, his right-hand men to help with church planning. He's just kind of in a holding pattern. But he's Paul, and so what does he do? He goes to the marketplace. He goes to the synagogues, right? And so as he gets an invitation to speak, he refers to this, or Luke describing what Paul saw, said that this was a place that was full of idols. And Paul is lamenting the fact there's just gods everywhere, and that everyone talked philosophy. And the way that it's written in Acts is almost kind of this parenthetical, snide comment. That everybody just enjoys talking about the latest ideas. Paul's a doer. He obviously shows that he can talk about the latest ideas. Yeah. But in the end, for Paul, you make a decision. And what he got frustrated with at Athens is that people just talked. And so if you read this and recognize that the human element of scriptures can play in here, there's a bit of humor almost in the way that this is written. Now that compares pretty well, I think, to a modern day secular academia place, a place like Penn State, a place like University of California, whichever, those places are like Athens now. There are places where there are lots of gods, and everybody's talking philosophy. Everybody wants the newest ideas. I mean, that's why we go to university. That's why we have some place like Liberty University to train people not just in ministry, but everything else, so that they can learn what's going on right now.
Just would say, the one thing Paul establishes at Athens is that he's no intellectual lightweight. That even though he is task-oriented, he's an apostle, his job's to plant churches where there aren't churches, but when he went to Athens, he could sure hold his own.
He certainly could, and we'll see a little bit later about how he proves his chops.
And you're kind of one of those guys, aren't you?
Well, you have to.
Yes.
If you're going to go into this environment, part of the reason that we confer degrees on people is that they have shown themselves to be competent.
You got to put on your intellectual big boy pants.
Yeah, you do.
You're going to play in that league. That's right.
And where your league is important. This issue of location was something I didn't anticipate as being important. But in the wake of the 2004 election, a liberal blogger put this map of the country up as President George Bush had defeated John Kerry, and he changed the colors from the familiar red-blue, and he divided the world into Jesus Land and the United States of Canada. And what was really amazing is that I had far more problems at schools located in Jesus Land than I ever did when I was at schools that were located in the United States of Canada, if you will.
Wow.
So what I want to do is kind of walk through a little bit the people who were part of my educational upbringing. I'll walk up here so I can kind of talk about these people that have been influential and important to me.
Great.
So when I went to Penn State, my first advisor was this man, it was Roger Cuffey. And when I met him, Roger was already in his 60s. He's still alive today. We still email every once in a while. I'm on his Christmas list. And he was a paleontologist at Penn State. And I met him when I was 18 years old, walked into his office, and we were having a fabulous conversation. And then he asked me a question. He said, "So what do you think killed the dinosaurs?" And at that moment, I had a big decision to make. Because I could either, this is 1990-something or other, 1994, and I could either talk about some of the various theories that are out there within the old Earth and evolutionary perspective at the time. I could kind of punt and say, boy, I don't know, that's why I'm here at school, right? Or I could tell them what I actually thought, and I thought that Noah's flood had destroyed and formed the fossils of dinosaurs. And so when I told him that, he leaned way back in his chair. He said, "Oh, you're a creationist, really? Well, of course you know you're wrong."
You know you're wrong.
You know you're wrong. Now, of course, I didn't.
No.
But I don't think anybody who asked that question actually thinks that the person knows that they're wrong at the time. But nevertheless, Cuffey still took me under his wing. I took a bunch of classes with him. I did senior research projects with him. And Cuffey was a gentle soul when it came to working this issue. He'd actually debated Duane Gish back in the 1970s. And so he was very familiar with creationists. He knew Steve Austin when Steve Austin was a PhD student at Penn State. And so he had a little bit of history with creationism. I wasn't the first person he'd ever run across for this. Now, of course, when you're an undergraduate, I like to tell my students, nobody takes you seriously.
No stripes on your arm yet.
Exactly. You haven't gotten to a point where people are worried about what you think very much, because you're at the point where you're learning about the language. And for me, that language is evolution, the language of ancient age, because that's what they're teaching me, and I have to show that I'm fluent in that, or at least I can read it in some way. When I went to South Dakota, located in Jesus Land, I ran into much bigger problems. I mean, as an undergrad, no trouble at all, but I realized that when you're a graduate student, master's and PhD, all of a sudden people take you very seriously. And they take you seriously because you're not just trying to get a bachelor's degree and get a job working in the oil industry. You're trying to be a peer. You're trying to be someone who's going to be working alongside the people that are training you at a higher academic. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it is, in some cases, a club. And South Dakota was a very bad club in many respects. But due to some problems and me being vocal about being a creationist, now they knew I was, but I became a little, probably too vocal at the time, made some decisions about what to share, and they didn't like that very much. I ended up losing my committee. I had people emailing me telling me that they wouldn't allow me to destroy their academic careers and the reputation of the school. And I ended up wandering in an academic wasteland. For several years, I didn't have a thesis project, I didn't have a committee to put together, and it took this man, Gail Bishop, to come in. He got hired in after my controversies, and he said, I was hired here to help students not make friends, so you're going to be my student, and I'm going to get your project, we're going to get you through, because you've done what you've needed to do. And so this is a point where you have to become more fluent. It's not just about learning the basics, you're trying to be able to solve problems within the field. When you go on for a PhD, now you got to be kind of a native, right? You got to be a resident in this place. And throughout that time, I'll just move on. This was David Fostovsky, and Fostovsky is a Jewish agnostic evolutionist.
Quite a combination.
And he took on a Gentile Christian young earth creationist as a student, and he knew I was a creationist. And so I really think of Fostovsky as someone who embodied the most proper liberal ideal of tolerance. He viewed tolerance as the best of all human attributes. And writing a dissertation, a 200-page work with 200 pages of appendices tacked to it, was really the ultimate test of fluency. Not only can you solve problems, but can you determine what problems should be attacked, come up with a way to attack it, and come up with the results. And I have to do this all within an evolutionary and old age fashion. They're not going to have me do a young earth creation dissertation.
Right.
So as long as Fostovsky's agreement with me was, as long as you do the work the way that we want it to do, I've got no issues with you. He once told me, no Jew on the planet ever wants to be accused of religious discrimination. So I'm not discriminating against you because you're a creationist. I would only discriminate against you if you did bad science.
A fair and honest man.
A very fair and honest man, someone I respect tremendously. And so walking through Athens really means that you have to keep the faith. If you're going to go through a route like I went through, you need to stay connected to the church and the family, especially if you're a student. The church is important. The student clubs or meetings and emails and connections outside are important, but the reality is that the church provides students with the breadth of experience that a club full of 20-year-old kids that are eating pizza every Friday night cannot do. And so when you're in that, the lessons that we get from Paul are that Paul learned to observe the culture by tailoring the language of the message to the audience, but without compromising the message. That was something Paul would never, ever do. And so, when we think of the things that Paul said when he was at the Areopagus at Mars Hill, he said, of course, that the city was full of idols, but he knew that because he had walked around Athens and spent some time there, watching the culture. He talked to them about this altar to the unknown God and said, listen, I'm not going to tell you about any other gods. I'm going to tell you about the one that you already know exists. This is the one that you need to pay attention to. This is the real God, the maker of all the heavens and the earth. I'm going to proclaim these ones to you. And he quoted from Greek poets on at least 2 occasions that we can solidly say, because he's saying, listen, I'm a learned individual. If I'm going to come and speak to the Stoics, to the philosophers, I know your language. I've spent some time with you guys. So for me, getting through grad school meant that there was going to be a lot of spiritual and academic stumbling blocks. And God promises that he's going to give us his presence while we're going through that, but he never promises safety. Paul was never promised safety, and we as believers are not promised safety. We're blessed to be in a country where the worst that happens to us is we get written up on, some news media or a blog site.
Paul died with a lot of scars.
He did. And before he died, he nearly died a couple times before that. So when I think of what we need to do in terms of walking through Athens, maintaining integrity by keeping close to the church, by keeping close to God, maintaining an active prayer life, the best opportunities that you have are to talk mostly with your students and not with the professors. They're usually, a couple ranks above you. But your students are your peers. They'll listen to you, they'll get into arguments with you, but in the end, they're with you in this journey. You listen first, you talk second. But you do have to watch out for people who are willing to be very aggressive. And there's always going to be those types of folks in any place, whether workplace, academia, and whatnot. Those types of people in academia that are going to try and climb over every rung, well, if you're a young earth creationist, you're on the bottom rung. You're the first one that they can step on. And so, with that, these are some of the things that I think that we need to think about as we're going to go through Athens. And the opportunities that happen when you've been honest all the way through means that once you get through it in a place like I am right now at Liberty, where I can start to advance the creation cause, it's because I've done this part that the next phase can happen.
Dr. Ross, those are tremendous points. I would humbly would suggest one more. You better do your work really well.
That's absolutely true.
You have to earn their respect by the way you do your work. You can't be sloppy and sloven as a creationist in that environment and make it.
That's a great point. And you probably need to focus on one or two areas where you're going to excel, because nobody can be good at everything. In paleontology, I was not going to be the best excavator and preparator. I didn't have that in my toolkit. But when it came to trying to understand evolutionary theory, that was something that I figured I could excel at, and so I would spend my time reading more about that, arguing more about that, for it and against it, to train my mind.
Well, you're a fascinating person, and you have some life lessons that will be valuable for all of us. We've got to take a break right now, and we'll be back, so don't you go away, because there's some great application to be made, and you don't want to miss it. We are back with Dr. Marcus Ross, and we are talking about his life walk. And Dr. Ross, you went to all these secular schools, and we see God's hand bringing you through that, but then he planted you at Liberty University, a Christian school. Tell us how that happened and what the significance of that.
Well, because I was always open about being a young earth creationist through my college years, I'd gone to some creation meetings, some academic level creation meetings, and I met Dr. David DeWitt, who's a cell biologist at Liberty University in 2002. And I was still in my master's program, so I was still in South Dakota, and it was during the dark times. But he would give me an email or a call every year, every 6 months, saying, how are you doing? How's the academic career progressing? Are you looking for a job? Have you prayed about Liberty, right? Wow. And whenever a Christian asks you, have you prayed about something, it means either you should have been or you need to, all right? And so when I was working on my PhD, I had a meeting with my advisor, and some funding that we were hoping for had not come in. And so he said, listen, you're going to need to start thinking about a job. You can keep working on your PhD, but you're probably going to need to move on and finish it remote. And so David Fostovsky said, do you have any place that you think you could get a job at? Well, Liberty University came to mind. And we were in the middle of the school was in the middle of a growth phase, and so I ended up getting hired in at Liberty University and finished off my PhD while I was there. And that was a great opportunity to be surrounded by other Christians, believers, and creationists to help support me as I finished off the tough work.
The rest of the faculty was supportive? And
very supportive.
For the first time you had a cheering section?
It was like being able to come out and breathe fresh air after being cooped up for a long time.
That's wonderful.
So the lesson for that for me was that being open about being a creationist opened the doors to Liberty, because it was only because I was going to those meetings, it was only because I had email contacts with people, and that they knew that I had been open about being a creationist. That meant that when I got there, they didn't have to worry about me being afraid of not exposing myself or being quiet. I hadn't been quiet, so why would I be quiet if I was there? Certainly. In a safer environment academically for me. So being open really opens doors. And right after I got my PhD, which was in 2006 in December, one of the faculty members at the University of Rhode Island decided to call up their good friend Cornelia Dean, who is the science editor of the New York Times, and say, guess what just happened here? We just graduated a young Earth creationist who's a paleontologist. Do you think that's interesting? And Cornelia Dean has written a lot about creation and evolution issues, and she's not typically a friend. And this is, shortly after a lot of big court cases have been going on. And so I graduate in December, and over that Christmas break, I'm getting phone messages from the science editor of the New York Times wanting to do an interview. And that's not what I had hoped for. It's not what I wanted. But nevertheless, it turned out that on February 12th of 2007, my face ended up on the front page of the New York Times.
Wow.
Talk about a slow news day, but still, it's the Liberty picture. And so my face ended up on the front page of the New York Times. And because I had been open about being a creationist, the quotes that they got from David Fostovsky and some other people at the University of Rhode Island reflected well on me because they knew who I was. If I had kind of come out as a creationist only afterwards, the quotes that they would have given would have been completely different. We didn't know him. He never told us this. And so as a result, the article was actually pretty good. It got me a bit of notoriety at the time. Obviously, you get on the front page of the New York Times and things tend to happen. And so you get some challenges. The most heavily trafficked science blog in the world is called Pharyngula. It's written by arch atheist and P.Z. Myers. He called me a trained parrot. This one I really like, the two faces of Dr. Ross, and they just took my Liberty image and mirrored it, and go, okay, well there's that. Creationists infiltrate geology meetings. When I go to geology meetings, sometimes they get written up.
Infiltrating.
Yes, we're infiltrating. Everybody knows we're there, but one of my favorites is this one. Redone Dr. Paleo and Mr. Ross. And so I've been accused of cognitive dissonance, or that there must be some sort of split in my brain, or something like that. So I've got to have multiple personalities or such. But again, if this is the worst that can happen to me, I'm not being drawn and quartered. I'm not being dipped in wax and burned in Nero's garden.
That's true.
The Christians that have gone on before us have suffered far worse than anything. If somebody writes a nasty blog post about me, praise God and move on and do something that's going to make somebody else angry, I guess. I ended up in the New York Times again later that year, along with some of my colleagues, John Whitmore, Kurt Wise, other paleontologists like myself, for a creation meeting. Ended up in the front page of the Washington Post, Dr. DeWitt and myself, for going to the Smithsonian Museum, bringing some of our students there, and ended up in a very good blog done by a philosopher of science, Janet Stemwedel, for Scientific American, and she actually had the question, what did Marcus Ross do wrong? Why all the vitriol? Why all the anger? And I responded to her by email, and she, with my permission, posted what I had written. So she and I actually had a very nice dialogue. I appreciated the approach that she took. Being at Liberty allows me to try and push forward with developing a better creation model for geology. So whether that's writing egghead nerdy papers like these ones up over here, leading field trips of geology at conventions and the like, I'm free to do that because I'm at a place now at Liberty where creation is affirmed. So the things that I really got to take away from the experience from the New York Times is that God honors faithfulness. I mean, He always honors that. Not always in the ways that we expect or want, and that choosing not to be safe opened a whole bunch of doors that were otherwise dangerous. And that's the sort of thing that really I think we need to think about as each one of us walks the paths that God has available for us.
I'm so grateful for God's hand in your life, and I'm so grateful for the trailblazer you've become to our young listeners. So thank you so much for sharing today.
Absolutely.
My friends, no matter what field you're in, no matter where God calls you, He calls us to truth, and He calls us to grace. And when we walk humbly before Him, He makes a way. He makes a way not only for us to prosper, but for us to be used according to His purpose. I hope some of you have heard that message today, not just with your ears, but with your heart. And young people out there, God can use you if you'll be fully yielded to His will and never compromise His truth. And above all else, remember this: it's God's view that He created you, and that should be your worldview too. Hope to see you again soon here on Origins. And until then, God bless you, my friend.